You are standing in a field of wild grass. It is roughly 14,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now northeastern Jordan. The air is dry enough to crack your lips. The sun is brutal. The plants around you look like nothing you would ever eat. Thin, papery seeds clinging to the tops of brittle stalks, hard as pebbles, bitter. Bite into one raw, and you would crack a tooth and spit it out. There is no reason, no obvious reason, to look at this plant and think food. But the people standing next to you are harvesting it. They are cutting the seed heads off with flint blades, collecting them in bags of animal skin, hauling them back to a camp where someone is going to spend the next several hours cracking, pounding, grinding, and burning these tiny, tasteless grains into something a human body can actually use. Not because it is easy, because it is one of the hardest things they will do all week. That sequence that tedious, painful, multi-step transformation of an inedible seed into food is the quiet beginning of the single most important thing humans have ever made. So how did we figure out bread? The answer is older than farming, older than pottery, older than writing, older than every city that has ever stood. Here is what I want to show you over the next 25 minutes. Bread did not arrive after civilization. It arrived first. And the hunger for it may be the thing that built everything else. Let's start with the part almost everyone gets wrong, because almost everyone assumes the same thing. We settled down. We planted crops. Then we figured out how to make bread. That is the story most of us learned. According to the last 2 decades of archaeological evidence, it is probably backwards. In 2018, archaeobotanist Amaia Arranz-Otaegui at the University of Copenhagen published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that broke the timeline. Her team had spent 3 years excavating a site called Shubayqa 1 / a hunter-gatherer camp in the Black Desert of Jordan. In the remains of 2 stone-lined fireplaces, they found 24 charred fragments of food. Under a scanning electron microscope, those fragments turned out to be bread, flatbread, made from wild einkorn / barley, oats, and the ground tubers of an aquatic plant called club rush, the date. Roughly 14,400 years ago, 4,000 years before anyone on Earth planted a deliberate seed. Hunter-gatherers, no farms, no fields, no storage, making bread. And not by accident. So the process required harvesting wild grain, stripping the husk off every individual seed, grinding it into flour on stone, mixing that flour with water, and baking the dough in the ashes of a fire. That is 5 separate steps, each with its own knowledge and its own tools. Nobody stumbles into a sequence of 5 steps. That is a recipe. But Shubayqa is not even the oldest evidence we have. On the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, at a site called Ohalo 2, researchers recovered a large flat grinding stone with starch residue still embedded in its surface. The starch came from wild wheat, wild barley, and wild oats. The site is roughly 23,000 years old. 23,000. That is the late Ice Age. Mammoths were still walking the earth, and someone on the edge of a lake was grinding wild grain into flour. Whether they baked it, or ate it as a paste, or boiled it into porridge, we cannot say. But they had already solved the critical first problem. Take a hard, indigestible seed and turn it into something a body can use. The grinding goes back further still. At Grotta Paglici in southern Italy, archaeologists found a pestle grinder in a layer dated to roughly 32,600 years ago. On it, starch grains from wild oats. And those grains had been thermally treated, heated before they were ground. Tools from the same era have turned up at Biloncino 2 in Italy, at Kostenki 16 in Russia, at Pavlov 6 in what is now the Czech Republic. 30,000 years ago, Across a wide band of Ice Age Europe, humans were already processing wild grain. Every one of them was solving the same problem. So what was the problem? The seed of a wild grass is wrapped in a tough, fibrous husk. Inside that husk, the starch, sits locked in a crystalline structure your gut cannot break down efficiently. Eat raw grain, and you get almost nothing out of it. You might as well chew wood. That husk is not an accident either. The evolutionary purpose of a seed coat is to survive being eaten. To pass through an animal intact, slashed, and germinate somewhere new. It is armor. Grinding cracks the armor. Heat does the rest. It gelatinizes the starch, unfolding those crystalline structures into a form your digestive system can actually absorb. The calories were always in the seed. Heat and stone are what make them reachable. Grinding and cooking grain is not cooking. It is a chemical hack. There is a reason this mattered so much to us specifically. Compared to other great apes, the human digestive tract is small. A chimpanzee carries a much larger gut relative to body size. One long-standing hypothesis, and I want to be clear that it is a hypothesis not a settled fact, is that we traded gut size for brain size. If that trade happened, it is a terrible deal for an animal eating raw plants because raw plants take forever to digest and give back very little. Cooking solved that for meat and for tubers. Grain needed something more. There is one more step in this chain. It shows up much later. It changes bread permanently. And it connects directly to something living inside your body right now. Hold on to that. I will come back to it. Once you have flour, the rest is almost embarrassingly simple. Mix it with water, work it into a dough, lay it on a hot stone, or bury it in ash. A few minutes later, you are holding something portable, storable, dense with calories, and light enough that you barely notice carrying it. Compare that to the alternatives. Raw meat rots within days. Fruit bruises and ferments. Tubers are bulky and heavy and mostly water. Bread is lightweight fuel. For a species that spent almost its entire existence walking from one food source to the next, lightweight fuel is not a convenience. It is survival. You can hear the moment it works, the hiss when wet dough meets hot stone, the smell of scorched flour, the crust going from pale to blistered in under a minute. That is the payoff. Now let's talk about what it cost. Grinding grain by hand is brutal. The simplest grinding technology in human history is called a saddle quern, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A large flat stone and a smaller stone you hold in both hands. You kneel on the ground. You push the handstone forward across the grain and drag it back, forward, and back. For hours. Do that every day of your adult life and your skeleton records it. At Abu Hureyra in Syria, one of the earliest villages in the world, the human remains tell that story with uncomfortable precision. Severe arthritis in the big toes, from curling the feet forward to brace against the ground while kneeling. Collapsed vertebrae in the lower back, from hours bent over the stone. Damage that shows up again and again in the same bones, in the same places. There is a separate study on Neolithic women in Central Europe that puts a number on the upper body side of it. Their arm bones were stronger than the arm bones of modern female university rowers. Different site, different region, same activity. The flour that fed the first villages on Earth was ground overwhelmingly by women. We know this because it is written in their skeletons. Their arms were remodeled, their spines were destroyed, their toes were deformed by the position they had to hold to do the work. Every history of bread talks about invention and ingenuity and the dawn of agriculture. Very few of them mention this. Bread was not free. If somebody paid for every single loaf with their body. It would take almost 20,000 more years before anything came along that ended that pain. Hold on to her. We are going to come back to that woman before this is over. Which raises an obvious question. If making bread was that punishing, why did anyone keep doing it? Because the product was extraordinary. Dense, storable, portable energy in a world with almost none of it. There is also growing evidence that early bread was a prestige food, something made for feasts, for gatherings, for rituals. Not something you ate on an ordinary Tuesday. This is where Gobekli Tepe comes in. It is a massive complex of carved stone pillars in southeastern Turkey, built around 9500 BC, thousands of years before anyone in that region was farming, and it shows evidence of cereal processing on a very large scale. Here I have to separate two things very carefully, because they usually get blurred together. What we have actually excavated. Enormous quantities of grain being processed at a monumental site by people who were not yet farmers. What we are inferring, that the pressure to supply those gatherings enough bread and enough beer for hundreds of people reliably on a schedule is what pushed human beings into deliberately planting seed. The first part is evidence. The second part is a hypothesis. It has a name, the feasting hypothesis, and it is not proven. I want to be honest about that because the idea is seductive enough that people repeat it as fact. But if it is right, the implication is enormous. It would mean the entire agricultural revolution, the single most consequential shift in human history, the thing that produced cities, empires, taxes, writing, and the world you are sitting in right now, began because people wanted a more reliable supply of bread. Hold that question. I will answer it directly before the end. Whatever the reason somewhere around 8,500 years BC people started bending the plants themselves. Wild einkorn does not want to be harvested. Its stem is brittle by design. When the seeds ripen, the stalk shatters and scatters them across the ground, which is excellent for the plant, and infuriating for a human trying to collect them in a bag. Genetic and archaeological work points to the Karakadag Mountains of southeastern Turkey as one of the regions where einkorn was first domesticated from its wild ancestor. What those early farmers did, almost certainly without understanding it, was select for failure. They gathered from the plants whose stems did not shatter. The defective ones, the ones that held on to their seeds. Those were the easiest to harvest. So those were the seeds that got replanted. Repeat for a few hundred generations, and a wild grass becomes a crop. Recent research suggests this happened more slowly and across a wider area than the old single cradle story implied. Domestication was not a moment. It was a drift. Then, at some point, somebody left their dough out too long. Instead of throwing it away, they baked it anyway. It puffed up. Here is what was happening. Flour contains two proteins, glutenin and gliadin. Add water, work the mixture, and those proteins unfold and bond into an elastic network called gluten. Gluten is stretchy. It forms thousands of tiny pockets. When yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, starts eating the sugars in the dough, it releases carbon dioxide, and those gluten pockets trap the gas. The dough inflates. The heat of the oven kills the yeast, drives off the alcohol, and sets the protein structure permanently. What comes out is soft, airy bread. The kind you actually want to eat. The Egyptians did not just stumble onto this. They industrialized it. By the New Kingdom, roughly 1570 to 1070 BC, Egypt was producing dozens of distinct breads, flavored with dates, figs, coriander, and honey, baked in conical ceramic molds by the hundreds of thousands. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it functioned as currency. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid in rations of bread and beer, Not coins, not gold, bread. And that pairing is not a coincidence, because bread and beer are the same invention. Both start with grain, both require grinding, both require water and time and fermentation. One common ancient brewing method was to bake coarse loaves, crumble them into water, and let the mixture ferment. So the bread was the yeast starter for the beer. Foam skimmed off the beer, went back into the next batch of dough to make it rise. A closed loop. One system, two products. Fermentation did something else too. It breaks down compounds in grain that block mineral absorption, releasing iron, zinc, and magnesium that would otherwise pass straight through you. And your gut adapted. Certain human gut bacteria have evolved dedicated enzyme systems for breaking down yeast cell walls, the cell walls of the same yeast that makes bread rise. We did not just invent this food, we made room for it. Now travel half a world away. To people who had never heard of Egypt, or Jordan, or wheat, in Mesoamerica, humans faced the identical problem with a completely different seed: maize. Raw maize is hard. And worse than that, it is a trap. Build a diet around untreated corn, and your body cannot access the niacin locked inside it. The result is a deficiency disease called pellagra, skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, death. The solution they found was to soak the kernels in water treated with lime or wood ash. The hulls loosen and slip off. The internal structure opens up. The locked nutrients become available. Only then is it ground. Only then is it pressed flat and cooked on a hot stone. Look at the sequence. Harvest. Break the armor. Grind. Hydrate. Apply heat. It is the same chain of steps as a flatbread in the Jordanian desert 14,000 years earlier. Arrived at independently. By people with no possible contact. Working on a completely different plant. Injera from teff in Ethiopia. Chapati and naan in the clay tandoors of South Asia. Lavash across the Caucasus. Arepas from maize in South America. Roti across a dozen countries that share no common ancestor for the recipe. The problem was universal, so the solution converged. The same way eyes evolved independently in dozens of separate lineages, because light is light everywhere. Wherever humans and starchy seeds coexist, bread follows. Which is exactly why bread became political. The Roman poet Juvenal gave us the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, describing how Rome's leadership kept the urban population docile by keeping them fed and entertained. In 123 BC, Gaius Gracchus passed a law selling grain to citizens below market price. That was subsidy, not charity. It took another 65 years until 58 BC, before Clodius made the distribution completely free. At the height of the empire, roughly 200,000 Romans collected grain every month. The bakers who turned that grain into bread the pastores were organized into one of the most tightly controlled guilds in the city. In the later empire, the profession became a hereditary obligation. You could not leave it. Your children inherited it. Bread was too important to leave to the free market. If you want to see what that looked like on the ground, go to Pompeii. When Vesuvius buried the city in 79 AD, it preserved more than 30 commercial bakeries in volcanic ash. Brick-arched ovens. Hourglass-shaped stone mills turned by donkeys. And in one case, the bread itself. A round loaf called panis quadratus, scored into 8 wedges so it could be torn apart by hand. Still sitting in the oven. Someone divided that loaf into 8 pieces for people who were going to share it. Nobody ever came back for it. Remember the woman at Abu Hureyra? Somewhere around the 5th or 4th century BC the rotary quern appeared. Instead of pushing a stone forward and dragging it back, you turned it. The motion was continuous instead of jarring. The flour came out finer. The work was still hard, but it stopped breaking spines. The Romans took it further. At Barbegal in southern France, built in the 2nd century AD, 16 water wheels were arranged down a hillside to drive a flour mill. Common estimates put its output around 4.5 tons of flour per day, though more recent research suggests the complex may have run seasonally rather than continuously. Either way, the principle had changed. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, bread no longer required a human body to be destroyed in order to exist. Bread left one more mark, and it is the one nobody expects. From around 8000 BC, people across the Near East used small clay tokens to count grain. Over the following 4,000 years, those tokens were pressed into wet clay to record transactions, and those impressions slowly abstracted into wedge-shaped marks. By roughly 3200 BC, that system had become cuneiform, the first writing in human history. Writing is the line that separates prehistory from history, and it exists because somebody needed to keep track of how much grain had been collected, stored, and handed out. The written word was born in a grain warehouse. The language you are hearing right now still carries it. The word companion comes from Latin com / meaning with, and panis meaning bread. A companion is someone you share bread with. Lord comes from Old English hlafwerd, loaf guardian. Lady comes from hlavdig, loaf kneader. The two words English uses for the top of its social order are, at the root, the person who guards the bread, and the person who makes it. So, did bread cause farming? Let me give you the honest version, in 3 parts. What we know for certain. Bread predates agriculture by at least 4,000 years. That is no longer controversial. The evidence at Shubayqa is direct and physical. What we also know for certain. Human beings poured an extraordinary amount of labor into grain, long before they ever planted it. They wanted this food badly enough to break their own bodies for it, for thousands of years, with no farm in sight. What remains genuinely open, whether that hunger was the cause of agriculture or simply the condition that made agriculture possible once the climate allowed it. No serious archaeologist still argues that bread has a single point of origin. The evidence for independent invention is overwhelming. But whether bread pulled us into civilization or merely walked in beside us is a question that is still being argued. I would rather leave you with that / than with a clean answer that isn't true. Here is the part that stays with me. Bread is ground seed / water and heat. 3 things. That is all it has ever been. And out of those 3 things came agriculture, cities, empires, religions, tax systems, written language, social hierarchy, revolution, and the global economy. All of it traces back to someone kneeling on the ground with a flat rock, crushing a handful of worthless wild seeds into powder, mixing it with water, and pressing it onto a hot stone. They did not know they were inventing civilization, they were just trying to eat. Tomorrow morning you are probably going to eat bread, toast maybe, a sandwich at lunch, flatbread with dinner. You will not think about the 14,000-year chain of human effort that put it in your hand. You will not think about the woman whose skeleton still records the cost of grinding the flour. You will just eat it. And that honestly might be the most human thing about bread. It is so fundamental, so completely embedded in everything we are, that we forgot it was ever invented at all.